Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Last year, due to COVID, there were very few in-person commemorations for the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And while our attention was justifiably diverted, I really believe we have to, this year on the 76th anniversary, make a bigger effort to commemorate the end of the war and the Canadian contribution in fighting the evil, and more importantly, to honor the lives lost from the atrocities committed within that war. And this is why I will be doing a series of shows, and I'm going to continue to do these shows, highlighting various aspects and events surrounding World War II. Well, today we're going to be discussing the Holocaust, probably the most recognized genocide of the 20th century, where over 6 million Jews were murdered in various Nazi atrocities, and in particular, in extermination camps. Well, joining me to discuss the Holocaust is historian Dr. Lionel Steiman from the University of Manitoba. Thank you, Dr. Steinman, for joining me for what I hope to be is a very informative and for those Canadians who may be familiar with the Holocaust, perhaps a refresher on what happened and why it's important that we continue to remember. So perhaps if you might, just so we can frame the discussion for our viewers, is what was the political climate like as we approached, as leading up to World War II, you know, with Hitler and the Nazis, et cetera?
Well, the political climate was one in which fascism was thriving in most European countries, and pretty well all European countries, whether we're talking about Portugal, which had a dictator, Italy had a dictator, Hungary had a quasi-dictator, Poland had a quasi-dictator, and in Germany, which had lost World War I, the shaky Weimar Republic was Germany's first experiment in democracy. And nobody really liked it. And it didn't take much for an unscrupulous orator like Hitler to gather around him people who believed that just as we have alternative facts today, so they presented what they regarded as the truth. Germany hadn't lost the war. It was stolen from them, just like the election in the US recently was supposedly stolen. So who stole the war from them? Who stole victory out of their hands? Well, it was the Jews. It was the communists. It was all these other characters. And because Germany was in such terrible shape with starvation in the hundreds of thousands because of the blockade during the war, because of revolutions and risings from various political angles, people were yearning for stability, for a strong arm, and that's what Hitler gave them when he came to power. And order was restored in the streets. People were working again, or at least that was the story. And the background to all of this was this constant barrage of propaganda against the Jews. Not that everybody was hating Jews, but enough were prepared to follow the Nazis in their line that nothing was done to help the Jews. So gradually, when Hitler came to power in 1933, little by little, measures were implemented that gradually dispossessed Jews of their property, dispossessed Jews of their rights, of their civil rights, removed their citizenship from them. In 1935, Jews were no longer considered citizens. In 1938 was the first great pogrom, a systematic massacre, a systematic burning of close to 1,000 synagogues and prayer houses throughout the country. Only 100 people were killed, but 1,000 were clapped into concentration camps, which had been just built recently.
And so that's, it was clearly a very, for lack of a better term, a tumultuous time for the Jewish people when you said they were stripped of their citizenship. So when you say they were stripped of their citizenship, then to what country did they live? If they were, Jewish, German Jews, well, were they not Germans? And where do they belong then?
Well, the thing is, they still lived in Germany. They were not expelled. They were not deported. They were not put in concentration camps. They were just increasingly ostracized, not allowed to sit in public park benches, not allowed to use public facilities, swimming pools, restricted in the hours in which they could shop. gradually things got so picayune, they weren't even allowed to keep pets.
Okay.
They had to turn in.
Dr. Steinman, I've got to cut to commercial break right now, but let's talk about this in a moment when we return from this break. Welcome back to Counterpoint. We're discussing the Holocaust in this month when we commemorate the 76th anniversary of the end of World War II. And joining me is historian Dr. Lionel Steiman from the University of Manitoba. Thank you again, Dr. Steinman, for joining us. Just before we went to commercial, you were describing the incremental and perhaps at times rapid disintegration of the rights of the Jewish people within various countries, specifically within Germany. Can you please elaborate? You said they weren't even allowed to have pets at some point.
They weren't. That's right. The measures were designed to make things as uncomfortable as possible in the hope that the Jews would eventually leave. But of course, they considered themselves as German as anyone else. In fact, more German, in much the same way as Jewish Americans are often the most patriotic and most attached to their country than perhaps other ethnic groups. And so Germany was considered the best place in Europe, and for many, the best place in the world for Jews to live. So this was a real shock.
Yes.
And people believed that it wouldn't last, that sooner or later, cooler heads would prevail, that just as with Donald Trump in the U.S., the hope was that the adults in the room would rein him in. There was a similar attitude towards the Nazi rule in Germany that, well, Hitler was all bombast and bluster, but that's just part of the act. Well, it wasn't part of the act. It was real. But
some Jews did leave. Maybe they read the writing on the wall, if you will, but some did leave. And where did they go? And that was the intention, you said, to get them to leave. So where did they end up going?
Well, as with anything else, people who have means, they are able to go where they want or where they will be allowed in. And so it's true that when Hitler came to power, there was an initial flight of better off Jewish families. Many went to Prague, many went to London, many went to Paris, where they thought they would be safe. Right. However, after that initial wave, there was no outflow. But then when the ratchet was turned up, there was a bit more of an outflow, and so on. So that after the Great Pogrom of 1938, something like 2/3 of the better off Jews had left. But the question has to be asked, where could they go? Right. What would they do when they got there? What countries would let them in? And you may have heard of the book by two Canadian historians called None is Too Many. And that particular book, None is Too Many, tells the story of Jewish attempts to enter Canada in flight from Nazi Germany and from Nazi Europe. And the answer of the Canadian Immigration Department, whose head was Frederick William Blair, he was a notorious anti-Semite. Wow. The answer was none is too many. So Canada wasn't going to let in any. It did let in a minuscule number. So, but for the majority of Jews, they didn't have much to begin with. What they did have, they weren't allowed to take with them. Right. And if they could manage to get out, they would have to have an exit visa, entry visa to where they were going, transit visas for countries through which they would pass. It was not easy. And when they did get where they were going, you would have people who were trained physicians winding up as doormen, taxi drivers, and things like that. Right. And so people would have to have a very, very strong motive to leave a country in which their family had lived for hundreds of years, to leave a profession, a network of contacts and friends, etc. So the whole question of why didn't they leave has a long answer, but the simple answer is they didn't have the means and they weren't welcome anywhere anyway.
Well, and the way I see it, Dr. Steinman, is since when is ethnic cleansing ever justifiable? Why should one have to leave their home? Why should people be ethnically cleansed? And so that's something to consider.
Yeah.
Obviously, as what you've shared is the leading up, the building up to the beginning of World War II, the official start of World War II. And I want to discuss that more in detail when we return from this commercial break. And once again, we're discussing the Holocaust in commemoration of the 76th anniversary of the end of World War II. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Once again, we're discussing the Holocaust, and joining me is Dr. Lionel Steinman from the University of Manitoba. Dr. Steinman, what happened once World War II was officially starting, when it officially broke out?
Well, you mean as far as the Jews were concerned?
Yes, sorry, with respect to the Jews and in the build-up towards, the camps and as we discussed the Holocaust.
Okay. Well, the first concentration camps in Germany were opened in 1933. They were not for Jews. They were primarily for political prisoners, primarily communists, socialists, and trade union people. And then they would round up alcoholics, prostitutes, a whole category of people that was labeled asocial. Only much later did Jews as such become a primary target for the concentration camps. And that happened once the war started. However, it did not happen in Germany right away. It happened in Poland.
Right.
In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And the first thing they did was to begin a program that targeted two groups. One was the Polish intellectual class.
Right.
The idea was that if you killed off the priests, the professors, the intellectuals, prominent journalists, then you would be able to rule the country with an iron hand.
Yes.
And just to give one example, the entire professoriate of Krakow University was shipped off to a concentration camp in Germany, from which few ever returned.
My goodness.
But the other group was the Jews they went after. And the famous Warsaw Ghetto was set up. The Warsaw Ghetto was not simply for the Jews of Poland or Warsaw. Ultimately, they were brought from various parts of Central Europe, and ultimately the population of the ghetto reached close to 500,000. Within a matter of months, between July and September of 1942, over 350,000 Jews were gassed at Treblinka, about 50 kilometers from Warsaw. So, I mean, that is one example of how the Nazis proceeded with their plan to exterminate the Jews.
Now, Treblinka is one of the lesser-known extermination camps, and why is that?
Well, I'll tell you, Tanya, it's I'm curious why people say it's lesser known. I think that's because all of the fame and notoriety has been given to Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was not only a concentration camp or a death camp, it was a huge complex of camps, many of which housed great industrial facilities whose names are familiar to this day.
Right.
Bayer Aspirin, BASF, Siemens, and on and on. And they used slave labor. They used the slave labor of Jews and others who were shipped to Auschwitz. When people arrived at Auschwitz, they were sent in two different directions. The healthy ones, relatively healthy, to work. The ones that were not fit, and that meant pregnant women, children, elderly, they went straight to the gas chambers. And you know, there is the famous tattoo on the marks, on the arms of Auschwitz survivors. Those who were sent directly to the gas chambers were not tattooed. The ones that were tattooed were sent to work.
Right.
Now, then they might be sent to the gas chambers after their work was no longer, because they were worked to death.
Right.
They were fed very, very low rations. So, your question, why is Treblinka lesser known? Well, it wasn't operating for as long a period. Auschwitz operated right up until the Soviets liberated it in January 1945, whereas Treblinka was finished its work by late 1942, and in 1943 they were destroying it to remove the signs that it had existed.
Yeah, and I think that's important to highlight, and maybe we can show that photo of the headstones or these stones with these cities' names. Showed up on the screen. But the erasing of history, the attempts, and obviously they were successful with Treblinka to a point, because now we did uncover it. But there you can see on these stones, they're the names of the cities, and we're going to talk about why those names are significant and how this extermination camp was actually ultimately discovered right when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion of the Holocaust here as we celebrate the 76th anniversary of the end of the World War II. Dr. Steinman, thank you again for joining me. Before the break, I was showing an image of headstones, if you will, or these stones with city inscriptions on them from the extermination camp or the remnants of it in Treblinka. Can you explain what is the significance of these names on each of these stones that are gathered, and how did this come to be?
Well, what happened with Treblinka was when its killing was done, the camp was destroyed because the Germans were afraid that the advancing Red Army would publicize the atrocities that they had committed. And so what they did was they attempted to exhume the hundreds of thousands of bodies, over 700,000, and they burned them on vast funeral pyres. And the buildings were razed, and any trace that this camp was there was removed. And what was left was just bare ground with the ashes of its victims underneath. So to commemorate the fact of its existence and the lives and deaths of its victims, 17,000 stones of varying sizes were put up on this field, and the names on the stones indicated villages, towns, and cities from which the hundreds of thousands of victims had come. Wow. And it is a very, very eerie and awesome sight. Very unlike Auschwitz, where the infrastructure that really ran the killing operations, much of it is still there.
Right. Well, I think this was a very good way, creative way, a very good way to commemorate those victims at Treblinka, because it's still visually, and again, we saw that photo several times now on the show, but visually, when you see these headstones, you say, well, these stones that are scattered, because again, there was nothing left. You said they raised it. It gives you, it is visually stunning to say, wow, these are many towns, many cities these victims came from, and it kind of gives you a visual sense of just the enormity of the genocide that was committed there. Very much so.
And it reminds me here that the major Holocaust memorial in Germany is the one that was opened several years ago in Berlin. And all it consists of is several acres of these steles, these obelisk-type stones. Now, the stones are of varying height and varying dimensions, and they occupy this field. It's right in the center of the city of Berlin, prime real estate. And there was a lot of controversy over whether people would really understand what it was all about. Well, the architect who designed it said he didn't care if people used it to picnic on, or if they were running around on the stones taking selfies. He wanted people to be free to encounter this memorial in any way they would. He wasn't hitting them over the head with anything. Right. And anyway, it's quite a sight to see. But it's similar to Treblinka in that unless you are familiar with the factual background of the Holocaust, you won't really know what this is, but you might be stimulated to find out.
Yes. Well, I mean, you mentioned selfies, and I have to share this. I've seen people post, these smiling selfies at the gates of Auschwitz. And for me, I find it very unsettling. I wonder what's going through their mind. Maybe that's just me, but for me, this is a sacred ground where millions were murdered. And for me, it's all about doing justice and commemorating the memory, and so that it never happens again. We only have 30 seconds before we go, but remind us again, what is the death toll of the Holocaust, and how do we make sure this never happens again? In the 25 seconds, I'm sorry.
Okay. The death toll is in the area of 6 million Jews. But millions of other people as well were targeted, but only the Jews were targeted for total extermination. And they were killed, more than half were killed in extermination camps, but several million, 3 million, were killed by killing squads who mowed them down with bullets.
My goodness.
Holocaust by bullets. As far as how this... how anything can be done to ensure it will never happen again, no easy answer.
And this program is dedicated to the millions of lives lost during the Holocaust.